Hello and welcome to the debate. Today, death. Is it justice? It's over 20 years since a prisoner was executed in Europe, but the arguments are still continuing to this day. To help us through the model maze, we have three of Europe's leading human rights campaigners with us today. Nordlander from Sweden, Dragan Petrovec of Slovenia, and Jeroen Schokkenbroek of the Council of Europe. Mr. Nordlander, you're Sweden's human rights ambassador. Can you tell me, why have you become so passionate about this issue?
I am against it because it reeks of vengeance, and vengeance is unworthy of civilized society.
Dragan Petrovec, you've worked a lot in prisons and your speciality is criminology. What's made you actually work against the death penalty?
Well, I'm not against death penalty only. I'm also against life sentence and also against any punishment exceeding 20 years of imprisonment. It's our practice from Slovenia.
Jeroen, you've been working at the Council of Europe now for some while. Can you tell me, why are you so passionate about the work you do there?
It is work for human rights, and that's something that has interested me and inspired me all my life. And working in the Council of Europe also gives me an opportunity to work for abolition of the death penalty.
So now we've met the guests, let's take a look at this.
A state that applies the death penalty is a state that violates human rights. Say no to the death penalty.
So that's a pretty hard-hitting spot that the Council of Europe has made to try and convince people that the death penalty is wrong. Jan Nordlander, you visited death row. Can you tell us, what's it really like?
One of the death rows that I visited was in an Asian country. There was a long corridor, and some 60 men, because there were only men, were lying on a concrete floor on mats. At the end of the corridor there was a brick gateway with an iron grid, and behind the iron grid the gallows. These men, some of them had been there waiting for 10 years. Every morning that they woke up would have to see the gallows beyond the grid, and I would say that is as close to psychological torture as you can come.
That's a terrible story. But Dragan Petrovec, you've been in prisons and you've actually been working with murderers. What is it like to face a murderer every day of your professional life?
Well, I did it for about 10 years. And what we succeeded is we opened the prison institution for murderers also, and it worked. Which means that if you have trust in people and in what is good in them, you can do much more than people generally think. So not to go into details, we opened the prison institution for almost 90% of people, regardless of the crime committed and regardless the length of the sentence. It was one of the best experiments we done.
Don't you think that people could accuse you of being a bit too soft on criminals? I mean, murder is a very violent crime. Shouldn't it really be that we should use the death penalty as a deterrent? What does the Council of Europe think about that?
The Council of Europe, and not only the Council of Europe, is convinced, and there is evidence for that, that the death penalty doesn't lower the crime rates. It doesn't act as an effective deterrent more than other forms of severe punishment. In particular, the main reason why people are deterred from committing very serious crime is the risk and the chance that they will be caught, that they will be facing justice. So enhancing the security, the certainty that people will face justice, is the best way to deter crime.
So for you, certainly death is not justice. But don't you think it's a very strong argument that it can deter crime? You know, if you have a murderer who's ended his life as in being executed, then it's going to be much better than to let that person out to murder again.
The whole philosophy of criminal justice is based on the assumption that people that deserve punishment have a chance to better themselves. And that is possible with long imprisonment terms, but it's not possible with the death penalty.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Petrovec, in your life in the prisons, do you think that those long prison terms actually work? I think you've got a very particular point of view on that.
No, it definitely doesn't work. I would say that 20 years of imprisonment is sort of maximum. If you work, if you treat people correctly in a humane way, you can do it within this limited time, and you don't need life sentence. Even 30 years is much too long.
But what can you effectively do to change people? Are people not made criminals?
Well, I don't believe in natural-born killers or criminals. So I think it's always our responsibility, small one, but anyway our responsibility that someone commits whatever he commits, whatever crime he has committed. So this part of responsibility is also that we try to repair the damage we have done.
What about you, Mr. Nordlander? I know that you're very experienced in different prison systems. You've travelled the world and seen different systems. What sort of examples have you seen that have worked well for you?
It's, I think that, you know, there was a big moment of prison reform that is already 150 years old, and to a large extent that still survives and is applied, and I'm thinking of the cell system. Now there are in several countries, as my colleague has been saying, experiments, and not only experiments, but rather well-established praxis going on with open prisons, with new methods of treatment, and so on. And of course, there is still, I think, a fairly large number of criminals who continue with crime, but one has to realize that also has social, economic, and psychological reasons.
What sort of person is a murderer? Is it the typical person that we see from the cinema or television, sort of white, rather tough person brought up perhaps in a bad background, or the mafia? What sort of people commit crimes?
Well, you know, discounting organized crime in the drug trade and so on, one of the reasons, perhaps the main reason why the death penalty isn't a deterrent, is that murder assassinations are committed on the spur of a moment in a rage of passion and so on. You do not think, and in the moment when you raise a knife against your partner or someone, because most murderers are domestic, whether you will be executed for it or not. It's just a moment of passion.
And that's the profile of a lot of murderers, is it? It's not actually the people who've planned the crime, it's more really the passion, the moment that drives them to it.
Indeed.
So in a sense then, we have really an idea that it's there but for fortune, go you or go I. Mm-hmm. So Jeroen Schokkenbroek, the Council of Europe now has worked against the death penalty for some time. Why did that move to abolition start, and how did it start?
It started quite a while ago. To go back a little bit in history, starting with 1950, the European Convention for Human Rights, which is the basic Bill of Rights for Europe, has a provision guaranteeing the right to life. But there is an exception made for the death penalty. So we're talking about 1950. Little by little, in the 50s, 60s and 70s, European countries started to abolish the death penalty in their own laws at home. And this gained momentum, such a momentum that in 1982 the Council of Europe adopted a new text, a new protocol to the European Convention, Protocol 6, which abolishes the death penalty in peacetime. That was a very important step, and that was followed in couple of years in the early 2000s by Protocol 13, which even abolished the death penalty for times of war. So Europe has traveled for some time, and we have now reached a stage where Europe is a death penalty free zone, and that is a very important achievement.
There's 47 countries in the Council of Europe. There's just one European country, Belarus, that's not a member of the Council of Europe and that has not yet brought in a death penalty ban. Are you making any moves to change that situation?
Yes, we are. We are counting very much on Belarus to take that step. We're currently very concerned about the risk of a concrete person being executed, the risk that that person will be executed in the coming days. We strongly call on the authorities to stop that, and the Council of Europe is, in its context with Belarus, doing everything we can to ensure that a moratorium is established.
Just staying on that point for a moment, the Council of Europe, of course, has to have the moral authority to try and impose what it says on governments. How do you go about that? How do you persuade governments to actually step up to the mark and do what you say?
It is all about dialogue, political dialogue, but it is also about awareness raising. In the countries in the Council of Europe, which have abolished the death penalty over the last, let's say, 15 years, we have done a lot of work to campaign in the countries, to speak to the experts of the Ministries of Justice, to show that the death penalty is not a solution, it's not effective to deter crime, and that it is a fundamental negation of human dignity and human life.
Let's switch the tables for a moment, looking at Mr. Nordlander. Say I was a mother and my little child had been brutally beaten up, raped, murdered. What could you, as a campaigner, say to me that would make me feel better? Well, surely there's a need in the human consciousness for some sort of revenge.
There is perhaps such a need, a psychological need, but I don't think that one should fall prey to that. And I think what I would try to, of course it's a very difficult situation and one can understand that person that you're describing, but I think it's necessary to spread information, to educate on this issue and to explain about the absence of a deterrent effect, to explain that once you have condemned somebody to death or executed them, it is irreversible, and unfortunately, as real life has shown, there are many mistakes by justice. There are a number of people in the United States, for example, that have been executed and then found not guilty because of the new DNA techniques or something like that. And I think even for a mother in this terrible situation that you were talking about, they wouldn't want that.
Yes, as the Dalai Lama said, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Mm-hmm. From your point of view, Dr. Petrovec, I imagine that your way of dealing with criminals and with murderers in prison can be quite controversial. What would your answer be to that question?
That's a question my students quite often ask. What would you do if you were a victim or your children were victims? In such a situation, I should be safely removed from any position to influence the sentence, because the victim can never be objective. The victim feels need to revenge, and that's why victims should be separated from the whole procedure in a way that she doesn't have an influence. Nowadays, there are so many proofs that we are behaving just on the contrary. The victim is not leaving the stage, but he or she is appearing and taking justice into his own hands, which is wrong.
Thank you very much. We've got some students with us today from the different universities of Strasbourg, and I know that a couple of them are very keen to put a question to you all. So we have with us Nicola from Scotland. Nicola, I think you would like to put a question to the panel.
Hi. I'm from Britain, where many people do actually support the death penalty. One of the justifications is because of our problem with overcrowding in prisons. They see it as a method to help this problem. What would you say to this justification?
So that's a very interesting question. Sounds quite cruel, actually. But there is a point of view which says that, well, the death penalty can be costly, but keeping criminals in prison may be even more costly. So shall we turn to you first, Jeroen? What would be your response to that?
The underlying issue is, of course, a financial issue. It is very interesting to see that currently in the United States of America, especially in California, there's a very important campaign going on where anti-death penalty campaigners have shown the cost of the death penalty. It's enormous. It's millions and millions of dollars more than serving long-term prison sentences on people. So the financial argument is actually a fallacy. It's not an argument.
But how can that be, actually? It sounds
It is extremely expensive to keep people on death row in high security cells with lots of extra personnel. The appeal system, the safety, so-called safety elements, safeguards that you put into place in procedural terms to give people appeal possibilities against death sentences is very long. It costs a lot of money. Think of all the prosecutors, the lawyers that have to be involved, the justices and so on. So maintaining the death penalty is much more expensive than a system without the death penalty.
Dr. Petrovec, would you have an answer for that coming from your prison background?
Well, about overcrowding, I see so many people with traffic jam, with underground met. What should we do with them? To reduce the population such way? So this way of thinking is quite a horrible way for me. But the less expensive way is simply opening the prison institution. We did it, we succeeded. I'm not so naive after having been there 10 years. I know exactly that 10, perhaps 20% of prisoners cannot be put in an open regime. But for 80% it's for sure. So it's the less expensive way, but it demands a lot of human investment to this project.
Mr. Nordlander, you've travelled quite a bit and your first story was quite terrifying. What do you feel about this issue?
Well, I think my answer would be very simple. It would be that a human life can never be weighed against the economic considerations.
Very simple, very straight, thank you. We've also got with us some of the students from the United States of America, where of course there is still the death penalty in many states. Jeroen has a question for us.
Yes, in the United States we have humane ways of putting people to death. Does this in any way mitigate the moral issues surrounding the death penalty? What is your opinion of this?
So, can there be a kind way to put somebody to death? Perhaps Mr. Nordlander?
I think this is a question of principle. It is not a question of method. And unfortunately, we have very recently, in the last few weeks or months, seen a horrifying example of what the supposedly humane lethal injection could mean to a person, because there was a case in the United States where the injection failed and the person lived for 2 hours and of course suffered for 2 hours. So I don't think there is any such thing as a humane way of execution.
And I believe that in some states they do still have the electric chair.
They do.
And Dr. Petrovec, your point of view?
It's a Latin expression, contradictio in adjecto, which means that things simply don't go. You can't do completely unhumane things in humane way.
And Jeroen, at the Council of Europe, this must have been an argument that's been put quite often in favour of the death penalty and that you've had to face. What would you say to that?
We don't believe in any humane ways of killing people in the criminal justice system. The death penalty is wrong because it is a denial of human dignity, of human life, of the right to life, and as my colleague said, the method is really irrelevant.
We've actually been having quite a lively debate also on Twitter, the social networking site, and we've taken in a few of the more interesting questions that I'd like to put to the panel. One question, again coming from the United States: how can European countries be against the death penalty and in favour of early abortions? That's a very interesting approach. Perhaps over to you, Jeroen.
It's a very interesting question. The view in the Council of Europe is that you cannot compare the two. Death penalty is clearly about the state taking the life, violating the right to life of an individual. There's no question about that. When it comes to abortion, the issues are very different. Two main differences. The first, there is no consensus about the beginning of life. There is no consensus in Europe, or let alone in the world, as to when exactly the life of a human being begins. There are different views about that. The second point is, of course, the position of the mother. In the death penalty, there is a relationship between the state and one individual. In abortion, there is a very important third person, so to speak, that is the mother, with her own rights, with her own personal autonomy, and for that reason, it is not as clear-cut. In fact, in European countries and in the world, there is no uniform approach to the issue of abortion.
What about the other panellists? How do you feel about that question? Mr. Nordlander?
I really don't have anything to add. Very well said by Jeroen.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Petrovec?
I agree completely. I just remember people in the United States, perhaps not only in the United States, who were ready and who did kill doctors who performed abortion. Mm-hmm. So in what way was it justified?
Yes, indeed. It's a very interesting way to look at the question. And we have here another very interesting question again. How can you justify the proposed abolition of the death penalty in the United States when 2/3 of the population support it and we live in a democracy? And I think this is one of the main points that's very often brought up in the death penalty debate. As Nicola already said, a lot of people in the general public would argue for the death penalty. How do you actually combat that argument? What can you say to persuade them? Perhaps Mr. Nordlander first.
Well, in the first place, I would say that the figure given in the tweet is not correct, because according to recent figures, 58% of the population of the United States are in favor of a moratorium on the death penalty. And secondly, I think that we should not mix apples with pears here. It is in the first place, I think, a duty of every government to inform and educate their population before that population is to take a political stand of any kind. And in fact, if you recall, when the death penalty was abolished in the United Kingdom, in France and in Germany, the public opinion was still in favor of the death penalty. But very shortly after it had been abolished, the public opinion turned. So public opinion in this case, in many cases, but in this case particularly, is very fickle.
And Dr. Petrovec, what's the point of view from Slovenia? Do people there support the death penalty? Do they not support the death penalty?
I think the figure is about the same, about half. But I remember, not the name, but some person from English Parliament who said, okay, majority is supporting death penalty. But who are we in the parliament, if not those who will show the right way? And just to quote some poet who said that the democracy is a constant conflict between a majority and enlightened minority. So, but nobody asks why the question of taxes are out of referendum. Because it's normal that everybody would vote against taxes. But with punishment, everybody knows what to do. It should be strictly out of referendum.
Now, it's a very interesting question for the Council of Europe, because, of course, the Council of Europe is the home not only of human rights, but also of democracy. So perhaps you would have something to add to that.
Yes, I fully agree with what has been said, but for the Council of Europe, democracy is not based on majority rule alone. It cannot be based on majority rule alone. If not, one could democratically elect a dictatorship. The Council of Europe's raison d'etre, the very reason we have been created in 1949, was in response to the horrors of the Second World War and the whole Nazi regime. I'll just recall that Hitler was democratically elected, and that was not a democratic regime. So for us, democracy is not more than just procedural, it's more than just majority rule, it is also a system of values. And issues like human dignity and the right to life are issues that are so fundamental that they should not be guided by opinion polls.
That's a very interesting point to start to finish our debate on. Hitler, Saddam Hussein, Milosevic, all these people were guilty of horrible crimes. Now, should they be put to death?
Question in return. The execution of Saddam Hussein, what has it solved?
So you believe that he could have been made a martyr?
It may well have been the case that he is now a martyr for some people.
Mr. Nordlander, what would your point of view be on that?
Well, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, has already discarded the possibility of passing a verdict on the death penalty. They don't have that.
Now, with your work, of course, you're going out to the wide world, to all the different countries for the death penalty to try and get a ban worldwide. Can you tell me, do you think there is hope that we will see that one day?
I'm quite hopeful, actually. We're definitely on the right track. Every year, some 3 countries abolish the death penalty, and as has been said here already, Europe, Central Asia, and large parts of Africa are already free, as it were, from the death penalty. So it's perhaps a slow march, but it's definitely in the right direction.
But reason to be optimistic?
I think so.
What about you, Dr. Petrovec? Do you see a bright future?
Not at the moment, because I can't decide if the abolition of capital punishment is a small step or a giant leap. Comparing the situation in Europe and reading the reports of Thomas Hammerberg, it brings to conclusion that the situation in most of European prisons are horrible. And this is sort of invention to have a parallel capital punishment. For instance, in France, 2 prisoners per week commit suicide. Just imagine that. If it is not a sort of capital punishment, or what?
And from the Council of Europe's point of view, the battle's been going on a long time. It needs to continue. How do you see it, and what moves is the Council making to actually bring about a worldwide ban?
There are different ways in which we work for that. First of all, we already discussed Belarus. That's a clear European priority. But we also have the objective of intensifying the dialogue with observer states to the Council of Europe. There are 2 observer states, the United States of America and Japan, that still execute people. And we are committed to intensifying the dialogue with them, to discuss the issues, to explain the positions, to give the arguments, and so on. More generally, we are very much side by side with the European Union. European Union is an important player worldwide for the abolition of the death penalty, and we support that.
So room for hope, room for optimism, and do you think that the death penalty will one day be consigned to the history books?
I'm certain about that.
How about you, Dr. Petrovec?
Let's hope, but at the moment the situation is very bad.
Mr. Nordlander, a world without the death penalty?
I am hopeful.
Okay. So there's obviously very much room for optimism and there's room for pessimism, but the debate continues. So thank you to our guests today. Thank you to everybody who's joined us. Please keep on tweeting and emailing, and we look forward to you joining us again.